Um, I'm Hurkadurkaa. Uh, I'm one of the prefects uh, who helps run our BGS group. There are a few other guys here, other prefects. Um, they'll probably introduce themselves later on, or I'll introduce them later on. But for this lecture, we're going to go over negative influence, um, which is the action of working in a negative manner against opposing factions, thereby decreasing their influence. We're going to talk about what this means, how it helps increase our own influence, and the proper ways to do this negative influence actions. If you guys have any questions, just feel free to shout them out. Um, I am looking at the PowerPoint. You guys can follow the stream if you want. Um, because of that, I can't see if anyone types a message or who's talking or anything like that. So just if you have a question, just feel free to shout it out at an appropriate time. Uh, at this point, so now we're gonna start. So to start, we're gonna just do a little refresher of the influence system, how it works, and just kind of just the basics of what influence is. So when we talk about influence, we're talking about the the percentage shown that is a it's the relationship between a minor faction and the system that said minor faction is in. Uh, if you look at influence a as a value of 100%, the influence of a faction is the percentage of that 100, which favors that faction or the control that they might have. Um, the highest faction, the faction with the most influence, is the controlling faction of a system. You don't have to be at 50% to be the controlling faction. You just have to have more than everyone else. Uh, this number changes every day based on whatever commanders do the previous day. This is why we have our Mercury run. Uh, for those unfamiliar, the Mercury run is when we gather all of these new influence numbers as well as some other pieces of data, um, faction states mainly, um, which is all changing based on, like I said, the contributions of players, commanders, us from the previous day. So these numbers are always changing. Now, within every system, there is a unique single day influence pool. And what I mean by that is there's only a certain percentage of influence which can be uh, split between all of the factions on a specific day. This depends on two main factors. The first is the system's population. The higher population systems like Samiz, which has 10 billion people, 10 billion population, have a smaller influence factor, have a smaller single day influence pool than smaller systems like Ariel. Um, to give you just an idea, Ariel is below 1 million population. I think it's below 100,000 population. I don't remember off the top of my head. The single day influence pool there is about 20%, whereas in Samiz it's about 2.5%. And like I said, Samiz has a 10 billion rather population. The other factor is conflict states. So if there is a faction in a conflict state, meaning their influence cannot change at all, that decreases the influence pool. So, for example, currently in Samiz, we have a election going on. There's also a pending war in Samiz that will start tomorrow. So, because of those two conflicts, the influence pool available is less than it would be if there were no conflicts going on. And as I mentioned, this single day influence pool is the amount of influence total that can be gained or lost by every faction within the system. Excuse me. Uh, every day, one of the first things that happens when the tick occurs, when these new influence numbers are calculated, is that every minor faction pays a tax of sorts that's based on their influence percentage from the previous day. So a faction that has a higher influence will pay more towards this tax in the beginning of the day than a faction with less influence. All right, so if we have 10% influence and another faction has 2% influence, uh, we're paying more than that 2% influence. Any questions on this stuff as far as understanding the influence system? A lot of this isn't known. Um, is there any questions up to this point? So now we're going to go into actually defining negative influence. So, as I mentioned, negative influence talks about doing actions with the objective and intention of decreasing a minor fraction's influence in a system. Normally, when we do BGS, we're doing trade, we're doing missions, um, we're submitting bounties. All of that is done as a way to increase our influence. When we talk about negative influence, we're talking about ways to decrease, to lower the influence of a faction. Uh, you do this, we do this through similar methods. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty linked. And if you understand the main influence, it is relatively easy to understand the actual actions and why they would work with negative influence. So, as I mentioned, you want to complete goals that lower a minor faction's influence. When you lower this minor faction's influence through negative influence, you are increasing the amount of tax, of that daily tax that they pay, which decreases the amount of daily tax that your preferred faction will pay, a faction that has received regular positive influence. Um, and thereby you're increasing the influence that that preferred minor faction is able to earn. So let's say minor faction A. We have minor faction A and minor faction B. You want to see an increase in minor faction A. So you run trade, bounties, you run all the normal stuff for faction A, and then you run this negative influence faction B. Faction B will pay more of that tax than normal because they're paying more. Faction A has to pay less tax. Because faction A is paying less tax because they have more positive influence, they will gain more influence than faction B, which will go down by more influence. This is why at times you'll see factions. I'll use Amenta for example. The influence cap there is about 1.6%, and yesterday we gained 1.3% of the influence. This is because we did enough negatives uh, to gain a few extra decimal places of percent, which in high population systems like Amenta and Samiz is really important because the pool, that daily influence pool, is so low. So, in order to use negative influence, regular positive influence has to be performed for whatever factions you're not working for with the negatives. If you don't perform this positive influence, then the faction B or negative influenced faction won't lose enough influence to see a positive difference, a large difference for that positive system. So basically, we sum this up to you have to do both. Um, if you want negative influence to work, you also have to do the positive influence as well. Any questions on this stuff? All right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So what about in lower population systems where you can do negative actions like, for example, like trading at a loss or like even system security murder if you don't care about the notoriety gain.
Hmm.
Um, it like would doing positive actions as well even matter at that point? So I'm talking about systems with maybe like a sub 100,000 K population.
Yeah. It's always in order to use negative influence correctly. Uh, you have to use positive. It doesn't matter what the population is. You have to do both. The population affects the actual percentage of change. So in a sub 100K population system, you'll see a larger drop with the negative influence, and you'll see a larger gain with the positive influence than you would in a more populated system. So yes, you do need to do both, no matter what the population is. The population just changes the numbers you actually see as far as how high or how low the change is. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So since I am new to this part, the tax is something I'm a little not sure of. So the tax you're talking about, is that just an additional amount of influence somebody will increase or decrease, or is the tax something other than influence?
Tax is influence that a faction pays every day. Um, so
Okay, okay.
let's say you have 11% influence. You might pay 1% influence in the tax. So thereby, before any contributions are given, you would go from 11% to 10%. Um, and then you would calculate based on influence contributions, whether it's positive or negative, uh, how much of a change the influence is. So it's basically just the daily influence tax is a reduction of your influence based on what your influence was the previous day.
Okay, yeah, I just wasn't sure, but yeah, so the tax is influence. Okay, I understand that
Yeah,
part now. Then,
it's
cool.
all
Thanks.
yep, it's all influence. Any other questions before we continue? All right. So we've gone over what negative influence is very briefly. We've reviewed the influence system itself, but we're gonna now go into the why. Why do we have to do this? Um, Very simply, by using negative influence, we will see a larger single day influence swing for the faction we are supporting. So when we say this, we say the change, the difference that we see. So for example, 2 days ago, when we worked in Amenta, we didn't have any negatives, and we only saw a zero point 0.8 influence change. Yesterday, we did have negatives contributed in Amenta, and as a result of that, our influence change, we went up 1.3%. Now, you may say, well, 5.5% isn't a lot, which it's not, but when you consider Amenta has a 1.6% daily pool. So again, that's the most you can gain or lose within a system for all of the factions. We went from gaining 50% to uh what would that be? 3/4 of the available influence just because we did some negative actions. So we saw a much larger proportional influence swing based on that influence pool by doing those negatives yesterday. So as I mentioned, when you are hit with when a faction is hit with negative influence, they have to pay more of this tax that we just mentioned. Um, and then those factions which receive the positive influence because someone else is paying the tax, they don't have to pay as much. Because you don't pay as much influence tax, you are gaining more influence because of those negatives. Um, so let's say normally without the negatives, you would pay 2% influence, but because of the negatives, you only pay 0.5% of influence. You are saving 1.5% influence that you would normally lose. So you'll see yourself with your contributions added, you'll be 1.5% influence points higher than you would have without those negatives. Does that make sense? All right. So here's another example. So faction A normally pays 7%, and faction B would pay 3% if only positive influence is used. Those numbers would be based on the influence that those factions have when this tax is taken out of them in the morning at the tick. If you use negative influence against faction B, they go up to 6% tax. So that's plus 3. Faction A only pays 4% of the tax, which is minus 3. So that minus 3, that 3% influence went from faction A to faction B, meaning faction B is paying faction A's 3%. So you're still getting that tax, but it's not nearly as much. And the faction that got that negatives is gaining that difference. Um, which means that they will go down more and faction A will go up more. All right. So now we're going to go into any questions about negative influence, about the tax, just the concept of negative influence, because this is something that can be rather confusing if you're unfamiliar with it. All right. So at this point, we're going to go into how we conduct negative influence. What are the methods that we use? And the first one is negative trade. So if you were here for the lecture last weekend, or if you've done trade, you might remember that when we look at trade, we're looking at the amount of profit which a transaction gives. So you buy commodity A from one system, you go to the system that you're selling it at, you sell commodity A at that new system, and there is a green number that says profit. Um, that green number uh, is the amount of profit that you're earning based on that buy and sell transaction. With negative trade, you are losing profit. So that number will actually show red. I'll show you guys pictures of that momentarily. But you are losing money off that transaction. So basically, you're buying for more than you sell. Uh, like I said, this is calculated based on credit sale as opposed to tonnage. So it's not, well, I'm selling 100 tons, so I put 100 value. It's based on the actual credits that is being used. As I said, you have to buy you have to buy the commodity for more than you are going to sell it for. So if you to use smaller real life numbers, right? If you pay $5 for a car, right? I wish I could buy a car for $5, but let's say you buy a car for $5 and you sell it for $10, you're making a $5 profit. Let's say you buy a car for $10 and you sell it for $5, you are losing $5 on that transaction. Here's an in-game example. if you buy tritium for 10,000 credits per ton and sell it for 250 credits per ton, uh, you are netting minus 150 credits per ton in that sale. I think those numbers are inverse. Yes, I'm sorry, those numbers are inverse. So if you buy for 250 credit and you sell it for 150,000 credits, you are netting 150. So just change those numbers real quick. Um, you are buying for more than you are selling. Smalling goods through the use of black markets also generates negative influence. This isn't a viable option for the Legion in most instances because in any systems that are in ALD spheres, or if they are uh, led by a patronage government, those black markets are automatically closed. So you might go to a system that supposedly has a black but if you go to actually sell there, it will say it will be redded out and say locked in the context tab. Um, that means you can't use it. So smuggling through black markets, while it would generate negative influence, it's just something that we are unfortunately not able to do. So as a refresher, so this is what a positive trade would look like. So if you look here, it's a little faint. It says 1,847 credits per buying by selling those units. This is my total income here. This is the number before I take into account how much it cost me to buy the 284 tons of coffee. This green number is the total profit for this transaction. So, like I said, this is a positive influence, positive trade transaction. So I am selling for more than I bought this 284 tons of coffee at. So this green number is your profit. This is a negative trade. So you'll notice here that this number is red. That means that the the amount of money that I would earn bringing in by selling this in the transaction. I basically, like I said, I paid more than I am selling it for. So this is the number that you are looking for. You are looking for a loss trade. All right. Any questions on that?
Uh, so I understand what you're talking about, but on the positive trade side, tell me if I'm wrong. But I know, like, if I buy one commodity, sell it, and I make a profit, the controlling faction gets X amount towards its influence. But then I was also under the thought that if you had multiple things up to three that you were able to sell and make a profit on all three, that would actually be a bigger increase towards the positive influence. Is that actually correct or is that not?
Um, I've never heard anything like that. Um, the more you sell for a profit, the more influence a faction will gain. Um, I don't think it matters what commodity you sell. Um, okay. So considering that I haven't heard about that in the last 7 or so months, um, I'm going to assume that that's no longer part of the BGS. So in that regard, I don't think it matters what commodity or how many of different commodities you sell. What matters is just this this profit, or in the screen that we're showing right now, this loss number. Um, it goes simply by credit. It doesn't matter what the commodity is. It doesn't matter how much of the commodity you bring in. It just goes by the credit value.
We have
Um,
seen
th-
evidence that trading a variety of commodities can help.
Right. So
if
that
So
goes into, and we'll go into
rather
that. Um,
than same commodity over and over and over again, and you want to try and vary it a little, and that's why we have the 4 categories on the spreadsheet.
right. There are 4 different areas for trade. Um, legal food, legal medicine, legal weapons, and legal other. Um, all 4 of those have their own category and their own like lever. If you've ever heard that term, for trade. So in that regard, yes, it matters what commodity, but if you're selling 2 different minerals, um, both would go under that legal other category. But if you're selling a mineral and then a legal weapon, those two would go under different categories. And then in that regard, yes, um, selling more categories is beneficial. It goes based on those categories. With which those categories, they're just the in-game ones. Um, it's a little faint, but if you can see it back here, there's the word medicines. Um, if you sell something that's under that category, it would go under the medicine category. Same with food and legal weapons, and then everything else goes under the other. All right. Any other questions about trade, whether it be positive or negative?
so isn't there a way to actually conduct like isn't there a way to actually trick the system in terms of how much profit or how much loss you've generated utilizing fleet carriers, if I remember correctly?
Yes.
Um,
Uh,
so so like with the idea of being you have your carrier, you place the commodities inside the carrier, whether it be uh like I believe the carrier owner has to set it up first, if I recall correctly. And then they can adjust the prices then, selling it back to either themselves or selling it back to uh, squadron members at either a lower or either at the minimum price or the maximum price, depending on whether or not they want it to be positive or negative trade.
yeah.
Is that
So when we're talking about trade, it's not gonna it's the commodity's not gonna go all the way back and see every time that commodity was bought. It's gonna go to the last buy. So, um, with the fleet carriers, how this works is a fleet carrier owner using his marketplace will set the buy price for that commodity, uh, as was said, either extremely low to generate high profit or extremely high to generate a loss. Um, and then you would go and sell it as normal, and the profit, so or loss in this screen's case, uh, will look at the buy point, the amount when you bought it from the fleet carrier, right? So it goes off that last buy. That's how you do it with fleet carriers. It can be complicated. Um, the other big part of it is, if I remember correctly, you can't do it in system. So if you have your fleet carrier in system, I believe it doesn't work. In that regard, the fleet carrier has to be in a different system. Um, but it is a complicated but very effective way of triggering negative trade. And looking at this picture, I got this picture like 20 minutes before the presentation. Um, considering that that's 94 million in loss, I would assume that this person did exactly that um, with their negative trade and used the fleet carrier. They set it for extremely high buy price um, in order to trigger this high loss.
Um, if I can also add something to that as well, just like a little closing note. If you are intending on using a fleet carrier to do that, it's really, really, really important that you understand that only the carrier owner themselves can mitigate any potential losses using this method. Because remember, you are still having to buy it from said carrier. You still have to exchange credits. Since carrier owners themselves, they control the entire flow of money back and forth from that carrier, they will never actually lose any money from it, aside from the initial buying of the goods, so the initial transfer of the goods. But if you're a squadron member uh, buying it from someone else's carrier, the exchange is actually real. So if you want to get back your money from buying from an extremely high price and selling it for extremely low for negative trade, you'll need to sort something out with the carrier owner themselves to get back any money you've lost.
All right. Uh, anything else with trade? That was a very good point about the fleet carriers. Thank you for making it. Um, anyone else? All right. So now we're going to go into failing missions. Uh, so this is talking about when a mission times out or when you do something which causes the mission to fail. Um, when we talk about failing missions, we are not talking about you picking up a mission and then 5 seconds later abandoning it. All right, and this is a very important thing to keep in mind. In order for a mission to cause negative influence, in order for influence to be decreased based on a mission, it has to fail. If, like I said, if you pick up a mission and then immediately go to your left panel and press abandon, you will lose reputation with the minor faction, but the minor faction will not lose any influence. Now, because of this, the best two methods for running failed missions are doing passenger failures and donation mission failures. I'll start with donation missions because they're relatively simple. What you do is you pick up a donation mission, you just wait for it to time out, and then you discard the mission. The reason donation missions are very easy to do is because they all have a 3 hour timer. I've never seen more than 3 hours on a donation mission timer. So, because of that, you can pick up a mission, go do positive missions in that same system for the other factions, and then once it says mission failed, you failed your donation mission, just discard that mission. Very minimal effort, uh, and very easy to stack. Passenger failures, you can do those a lot faster. What this comes down to, and there's a guide to this, and I want to say the BGS operations channel. If it's not in that one, it's a pinned message in the BGS questions channel. But what you do for passenger failures is you pick up a passenger, the passenger missions as normal. Um, you make sure that those passengers don't like damage. I forget what the in-game terminology is for it, but it'll say these people don't want to take any damage, and then you take your passenger ship outside the station. You turn your shields off, and you just bang into the station a bunch of times until your ship gets to like 60 or 50% hull, and the passengers will start complaining, and it'll say like, take me to the nearest station, I'll find my own way home. um that is how you fail a passenger mission. When you get that mission saying, uh I'm done, you've taken too much damage, that will then cause the passenger mission to fail. Another way to do it is sometimes you'll get missions that say, like those ones where you drive around your SRV and get scan data. It'll say like if you die during this mission, it'll be an automatic failure. That's another mission that you can do. Although in that situation you're eating a rebuy, so it's not necessarily one of the better ones to do, but it is a way to get failed missions. The most important part about failing missions is that when you go to the mission screen, and we'll show you a picture of this in a minute, um, it will say either abandon or discard. If it says abandon, that means that the mission has not yet failed, and you will only lose reputation. If it says discard, that means that you have failed the mission, and by pressing that discard button, it will cause that negative influence. The important thing to keep in mind with that is that the negative influence is not believed to go into effect until you press discard. So let's say you fail a mission and you just leave it in your transactions tab, it won't generate, it won't put in that negative influence until and unless you press discard. Now, as far as calculating the actual influence generated by failed missions, the negative influence generated, I should say, there are two theories. Uh, the first one, which is the one that the Legion uses, is that every failed mission is worth 2 points. So, two of those little plus marks that we use to calculate regular influence for missions. Uh, every failed mission is worth 2 of those. The other theory is that different missions are worth different value based on the highest influence possible that you can gain from that mission. Uh, this theory is a little more complicated and intricate, and there's evidence that points to both, but it's also really hard to determine which one is the most accurate. So, because of just simplicity's sake, the Legion says that every failed mission is worth 2 influence points. So, minus 2 of those little plus marks that you would see for a mission. So, here we have a failed mission. This was a passenger mission that someone ran. Uh, and they went out, they banged their ship along the hull of a starport. They got their hull below a certain amount, and this passenger said, "Take me away, I don't want to be here anymore." And the mission was failed. Notice how right here it says discard. This means that the mission has been failed. As you can see, it also says you have failed the mission. By pressing this discard button, you will gain negative influence. If this button here said abandon, then you would only be losing that reputation. You wouldn't lose any influence. Any questions on failed missions?
2 questions, Circa.
Yeah, what's up?
If I self-destruct my ship, does this? I mean, it still allows me to discard the mission.
For passenger missions?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you self-destruct your ship with passengers on it, it's the same thing. Uh, you're still eating a rebuy. So,
Right.
if you have a really cheap ship that you don't mind paying the rebuy for, then yeah, that's probably an easier way to do it. But so that would work. And your other question?
Well, just a follow-up on that one. If I pick up passengers that are wanted, a lot of times I'm not smart enough to avoid the scans, so the station will blow me up anyway. So it's easier just to self-destruct when I figure out I've done that. My other question was if I take one of those donation missions and I accidentally click and give them the donation when I meant to make it negative, I've made it positive instead. Is there a correlation of how much negative then I need to do to make up for that?
So those donation missions are almost always worth 2 influence. So as far as to wipe the positive out, you would need to fail one mission. As far as to get back to failing, you would need to fail 2 missions.
Okay. All right. So it's kind of an even. If I accidentally give them 2, I can take away 2, and that balances out.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
Any other questions for missions? Failing missions.
More of a little addition to the passenger one. There is a little thing that you can accidentally do if you're taking damage yourself. If you end up taking too much damage, your passengers will actually abandon ship, and you will lose the escape pods in those passenger cabins. So, say you go back into the station. If you want to pick up another passenger mission, you'll have to, if I recall correctly, you have to rebuy the escape pods. I believe it's in the rearming tab, if I recall correctly. Is that is that still a thing? In terms of rebuying?
I
I'm
don't.
not familiar with
I don't. I'm not familiar with that either. I've never heard of that.
Because I only remember because because one time I completely lost all of my passengers. I didn't die. I just took enough damage that they literally jumped off the ship. um, there was a message that led to that. So whereas if you take a certain amount, it'll fail the mission. Um, if you still take even more damage, then they will just eat themselves off the ship, but you'll still have to discard the mission yourself. But then also have to pay a certain amount for restocking the cabins.
I would imagine if that happens, you'll still have in your left panel, you'll still have the discard option.
Yeah, no, I just mean in the sense of like if you take too much damage, you'll end up having to buy those again. So it'll cost like I believe the amount is relatively minuscule. They cost nothing. Brilliant, man.
All right. Any other questions? Alrighty. So now we're gonna go into murder. And at this point, Tarkus, Centurion Tarkus is like our biggest criminal in the Legion. He does all of he does all of our murders for us. So he probably knows more about murder than me. So at this point, if he has anything to add, just Tarkus jump in. So when we talk about murder, we're talking about when we kill clean NPC ships within a system. We're not talking about cops, and I'll get into that in a minute or two. We're talking about those guys with the random names that when you scan them, it says clean. Um, this is not only the simplest form of negative influence as far as how easy it is to do, or at least understand, but it's also the most effective. Um, anyone who's familiar with bounties um, would recognize that bounties are probably the easiest way to gain influence. Murder is the exact opposite of bounties. It is the easiest way to lose influence. All right. So murder is the exact opposite of bounties. Um, all you do we don't have solid numbers before I get into how you do it. We don't have any solid numbers. But like I said, it's basically the opposite of bounties. Um, it's hard to tell with really all of the negatives. Um, as far as how much negative actually is done with these actions. Trade is the easiest because it goes by credit. Um, just trade mechanics. We already went into how the two different theories about failing missions. Um, Murder is not a normal aspect of the game, not something that's done a lot. So because of that, there's really no like X amount of murders will trigger Y amount of negative influence. But we can look and see that when we have more murders, um, we see a larger input of negative influence. When we don't murder, that number is extremely less in our favor. There's less negative influence without that murder. So murder is the best way for negative influence.
We can fail 40 missions and have 10 murders and actually see more effect.
You cut out at the end.
Sorry. I said, you can have 40 mission failures and you have so much of a loss of a faction. 10 murders will do more than 40, it seems, mission losses.
Yeah.
It's how we were able to get the initial election in semis. I mean, we couldn't do it failing missions. We tried.
Yeah. Like, is Nat here? Is Nat on the call? No. So I brought this up last weekend. I said how Nat once told me that bounties are crack. Murder is the crack of negatives. All right, so that's the way to look at it. As I mentioned, killing cops. So this is any of those police forces. So in Empire space, it's internal security services. ATR. If you murder enough, uh, these kills on cops seem to not generate any negative influence. Uh, we've come up with this through testing, where we'll kill 30 cops, and then the next day we'll kill 30 uh civilians, and we'll see a much higher number of murders of negative influence based on those clean civilian kills as opposed to the cops. So whenever you're conducting murder, you want to stick away from killing ISS or ATR. One, they will just keep coming after you, um, as long as you're killing them. And two, there's no point because the negative influence is, if there is a negative influence for these ships, it's extremely low. As far as the kind of ship you want to use a hull tank that is quick enough to kill someone extremely quickly. You want enough firepower to kill someone extremely quickly while also being able to outrun any system security. Uh, when I made my murder ship, when we added murder to our main sheet, uh, I spoke to Tarkus and he said use frag cannons, because I can get up right next to a ship, press the trigger 3 times, and the ship is dead. Um, is an extremely fast ship, so if ever I do get stuck and I'm getting a bunch of kills on clean ships and ATR system security shows up, I can quickly get out of there. The reason you want a hull tank is ATR has I think it's called phase sequencing, which means that their lasers will go through your shields. Uh, I once, when we were getting into semis, I was murdering with a 9K shield Prismo cutter, and ATR showed up and I lost shields in like 3 seconds.
They have station guns.
So murder is just murdering when you have to deal with ATR. Like Tarkus said, those guys have station guns. You don't want to waste time building up shields. That said, I still would recommend bringing a shield generator. Bring a smaller sized bi-weave, and then throw on hull reinforcement packages whenever possible. But just keep in mind that your shields will go down extremely quickly. So, unlike the other negative methods where you'll really only just lose a little bit of rep, if any, I don't think you lose any rep from negative trade. You'll lose some for failing missions, but you can easily gain that back. There are a lot of downsides to murder that you need to understand and be aware of before you start murdering. So,
Uh,
go ahead. Do you have a question?
Sorry, I missed a little bit, like about like a minute's worth. Could you just recap what was said?
What was the last thing you heard?
We were talking. I believe you were mentioning. You mentioned ATR for a second, and you were talking about how system security deaths don't decrease influence as much as civilian ships.
Right. So if you kill a system security or ATR, that it seems to not generate negative influence. Therefore, you want to stick to those just civilian NPC ships. Obviously, and I didn't mention this the first time, but power play ships also won't generate any negative influence. So if you kill any power play ships, you're not going to gain any negative influence. As far as shipbuilding for murder, like I said, hull tank, because ATR uses phase sequencing and station weapons basically, so they will kill you extremely quickly and they will destroy your shields in about 3 seconds. All right. Any other questions?
We don't know how much system security affects murder. We don't think it's as much. I mean, you can kill a couple of security ships and your notoriety won't even go up sometimes. It's just... But we know clean ships work, so that's why we focus on clean ships.
The other thing is, if you ever see a ship, obviously wanted won't generate any negative influence. Sometimes you'll see ships that say lawless. Lawless also does not generate negative influence. I forget when and where it was, but there was someone who reported seeing lawless ships at like one of those planetary stations that you can go murder at, those non-landables. And they asked, does this count? Those do not count. And if you think about it, lawless is the status of people that you see in a CZ when you're fighting in wars. So because of that, lawless it's not, you won't get a bounty for that person, but it also doesn't generate any negative influence. So those guys you don't want to kill either in this regard for murder. So as far as downsides, so like I said, unlike the other ways of generating negative influence, there are a lot of downsides, a lot of negatives with conducting murder. So the first one is notoriety. So when you gain notoriety, it will lock you out of certain station services, specifically Interstellar Factor. If you have notoriety, you are unable to use Interstellar Factor, which means when you get a bounty on your ship, you will not be able to pay it off using Interstellar Factor. So that ship is basically useless in that power space. It will also decrease your reputation with the minor faction being killed and the superpower. So, Tarkus, are you still locked out of the Empire?
No, I got back in.
So, Tarkus did enough murder that he cannot land in any system, in any station within the entire Empire. Now it takes a lot of murder to get to that point. That was like months worth of murder, but it will very quickly decrease your reputation with a faction. So, for example, there were a couple of us who, when we were working in Samiz, were doing murders there, and we could no longer land at any system, any station owned by the Samiz Imperial Society, which controlled the system at that point. So like we started bringing carriers in so that we could dock at those carriers if we needed to. Um, so it's very hindering as far as your locations for landing, especially if for some reason we have to murder in Legion space. Because those bounties you'll start to get bounties against the Legion as well. For murdering in their systems. In addition to getting a bounty from the controlling faction, you can also possibly get a bounty from the superpower. Which will happen with this is this locks you out of all stations within that superpower. Similar to if your reputation were to be decreased. You can pay off this bounty, and it'll unlock those stations again. But keep in mind, as long as you have notoriety, you cannot pay off that bounty, because you would have to pay it off from an interstellar factor. As far as decreasing your notoriety, for every level of notoriety, it takes 2 hours of in-game time for you to actually decrease your notoriety. This doesn't mean like sitting on the main menu. Like, your ship has to be logged in. Even if you're just sitting in the station, that's fine. But you have to be sitting in your ship for 2 hours in order to decrease notoriety 1 level. So if you're at notoriety 10, which I've been at maybe once, you have 20 hours of just sitting there doing nothing or playing or whatever before you actually have your notoriety back to 0 and you have access to interstellar factors again.
Quick question. Does this work in solo as well, or do you have to be in open?
I believe
It works in any mode, but if you're sitting in a station, just go open. It doesn't hurt anybody. And you can still play while you have notoriety. You're just fine. Just you can't pay off any other bounties that you go. So if you're wanted in, say, one system's space and that controller doesn't want you there anymore, that's fine. You can go do other stuff. You can go fort. You can go undermine. You can go do other stuff. You just can't pay off any bounties, so you got to be careful. So if you slam into some ship or Sidewinder and freaking massacre the thing in in LL space, then you're locked out of LL space because you got a 2,000 credit bounty that you can't pay off.
Okay, I just asked because if you're sitting AFK for 20 hours in open and taking up pad space, I feel like that wouldn't be very nice. Thanks, though.
Nobody cares. Just go to my carrier or something like that. It's fine.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions for Murder? Or Targus, anything else you want to add?
The biggest thing is ATR. You got to watch the security level of a system when you go into it. A high security system like semis, for example, the ATR show up after 2 kills, something like that. So when you do kill somebody, what you can do to reset that counter is you jump out of the system and then you come back. So if you're in semis and you kill just 2 ships and then you leave really quick and then come back, you can kill 2 more ships before ATR comes on your 3rd kill or something like that. It might be 1 ship and the second one brings it, but you can always jump out and jump back in, and you can never see ATR. Another thing, if you wanted, bounty hunters come after you everywhere in that ship, and they're irritating because they'll attack you in space, like if you're wanted in Amenta, for example, but then you come back to Legion space, they still attack you, and you can't fight back, because if you fight them back, you get wanted in Legion space because the bounty hunter is clean. and they don't stop. The only way to get rid of a bounty hunter is to kill them. That's the easy part. If you can head over, somewhere and just do it and take the bounty, or not, or you can, even easier, you can get rid of them by winning an interdiction. So if you're murdering in a system and you're not worried about ATR yet, but the bounty hunters keep coming, just fly off of the nav beacon and fly off for a little while and wait for them to interdict you. Win the interdiction and they'll go away. But if you don't win the interdiction and they're still around, every time you drop on somebody you're trying to kill, they drop with you. If you drop on the beacon to go scan ships, they drop with you. They're your new best friend.
I actually have a few questions. I also have a few points, and I do want to dispute something with Tarkus's claim about the ATR as well, because personal experience with me has shown different results. If did you want me to do the dispute first, or go through the other points?
Go ahead. I don't mind.
So the main dispute I have in terms of ATR is the spawn rate. So I believe, if I recall correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. You said in like high security, there's like a low amount of kills before ATR shows up in like high security systems. Is that right?
Yes.
I have had a different experience in that sort of field. I've been in high security systems. I've literally murdered about a few dozen and still hadn't had ATR show up. In my experience, has always been a bit of a random chance, but I have seen ATR pop up in high security systems more often, just not that often. And
it's 2 or 3 in Amenta and semis. Those are like super high security for some reason because they're the core of the empire. But yeah, you're right. You can go 3 or 4, or maybe even a dozen kills in lower systems, lower population systems, and get away with it.
A couple things to point out as well about the ATR for people who have never even seen them before. If you are unsure, because obviously when they drop in, you may not be 100% certain that it's them. One key distinction about ATR that no other system security has is that ATR actually has voiced lines. If you hear a voice, like an actual voice line that you can properly understand, that is ATR. You need to jump out of there if you're not prepared to deal with them.
You just jump out right away. You'll hear it'll say, "This is Omega Company of the Imperial Advanced Tactical Response. This system is under lockdown," and then you gotta go. It's time to low wake out.
Although it is very possible to kill ATR, it is never, ever, ever worth it, and it's completely ridiculous to try and kill them. They'll always be in a wing. My entire experience is they've always been in like vultures, which
unless you just really want a challenge.
Yeah, if you want a challenge, if you want to have the clout for doing it, go right ahead, but expect to see the rebuy screen a few times. Even with a fully optimized build against the ATR being super hull tank, you're still going to have an incredibly difficult time. There's a very unlikely chance that you'll be able to kill all of them. Maybe you'll kill a couple ships, but at that point, you'll be experiencing module failures because unlike with other system security, ATR actually focuses on one module at a time. They'll actually destroy the module, then swap to another target. So you'll experience a lot of malfunctions and the loss of certain systems. So if you're unlucky and they destroy your drive first, it's GG at that point. So never in your life.
Cyberpunk NPCs.
Yeah, that exactly like Cyberpunk.
The best thing to do is to just run when you see them. Low wake out and then high wake out of the system and come back, and it sort of resets the timer, so you can get some more kills in before they show up. But yes, high security systems, the count is 2 or 3. Go to semis and you can try it right now. I'll sit and wait.
Also, one thing in regards to the superpower about superpower reputation, I've actually had my superpower rating for the Federation become completely hostile, right? 100%, negative 100%. But I've actually been able to dock at Federation-owned stations, so like inside Federation space, owned by Federation minor factions. I don't know if that's still the case. because this the last reference I have for it was about 7 months ago, give or take. So so when you mention about the superpower rating, like the superpower reputation locking you out of all empire, like empire stations or federation stations, is that still a thing, or did you do this? Or are you talking about it only in places where like
That happened to Tarkus like what 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, they
Well,
tell you
like,
that the station tells you that you're not welcome there, and I didn't pursue the issue because if you get within 4 kilometers of a station that doesn't want you there, they will open fire. I didn't try it. They
so
said you're not welcome. What the exact words
Yeah.
of the station says, you're not welcome here in the Empire. I'm like, oh fuck that, I'm going away.
Yeah, so I've actually done that as well, and so when I was doing it at the Federation space, they said, like, they even said, criminal, like criminal detected, lethal response authorized, but I've still been able to dock there.
I'm not going to tell our members to try that. Let's just not. Okay.
Although I will say this, one thing that I've always noticed, if I've ever been in a place where the station is automatically lethal to me, the station itself will actually appear red. So even if it hasn't fired on you yet, it will always appear red. Same with system security when you're in a place where where the controlling faction is hostile to you. They will always appear as enemies on your radar. So that's off mine. I'm more than happy to like have another look at that. Like if you want me to like drop my influence somewhere else in like Federation space or something.
Not really. I think the idea is don't get there and trying to get some overlines so that your average person can do murdering in the game without, and avoid as many downsides as possible. I don't want to risk somebody's brand new freaking cutter and have them get a 50 million rebuy and something like that by messing around with edge cases.
In that case, then the last thing I just want to mention is and also kind of ask as well, because I've seen conflicting evidence. I've seen other people say other things. Has-res in systems where there actually is a has-res. Murdering clean ships there. Two main questions is, one, does it still count in terms of negative influence on clean ships? And two, if it does, is it as good as is it actually as good as killing a normal instant ships, or is it like reduced, or like what?
I think it's the normal influence. I haven't tried it at a has-res so much as a comp beacon.
Well, a clean shipping system is a clean shipping system. It doesn't matter where you find it.
Yeah, I did a lot at comp navs, because comp nav, if a system has a comp nav, it's a wonderful place to murder because the cops can't come and there's no ATR, so you can just keep it up.
Well, yeah, but they'll usually be wanted, won't they?
No, comp nav spawns a lot of clean shit.
Yeah, there's more wanted ships in a comp nav than in others. So I mean, theoretically, in a comp nav, you could do both if you're trying to increase our influence somewhere. You could kill the
so just go and kill everything.
Yeah, like literally. So kill all the wanted ships.
Not a clean Legion ship or supported faction ship, rather.
Yeah, like you can go and you can kill a clean ship that you're trying to go down. And that is one thing that I don't think I mentioned. When you're doing murder, the murdered ship has to belong to the faction that you're trying to decrease. So like let's say we're in a Legion system, and I see a clean ship that belongs to some other faction. You're gonna decrease the influence for that other faction, not for the Legion. So that's one note. The other note is, so how you would do this with a comp nav is you would murder all of the wanted ships in the comp nav, thereby gaining bounty vouchers for the system controller. And then you could also be doing the murder of any of any factions not our own that we're supporting. And that's how that would work.
Generally, when I murder, the first thing I do is I drop at the nav beacon, and then I scan everything. If I'm trying to murder an independent, I ignore the Imperial ships, and I just click through all of them one at a time, and I try to see what faction they're in. If there's a group of 3, you can safely ignore the other 2 and just keep moving down the list until you've scanned all of them. Always scan all of them, including the Sidewinders, Haulers, and Vipers, because you never know. One of them is there. Then you kill them as quickly as possible. You commit the murder, and then you low wake out. Then, a nav beacon is kind of like a CZ in the regard that it takes a little while for them to respawn and reset, just like a CZ does. You guys know how you take a couple of minutes in between war zones before you go back in. So in that couple of minutes, you go into Super Cruise really fast, and you try to scan all the ships there in Super Cruise. Then when you've scanned those and a couple of minutes have gone by, you drop down at the beacon and scan again. And that's how it's just a grind. And when you find them, you kill them. You're always happy to see a group of 3. When you see a group of 3, always kill the escorts first, and remember the names of all of them so you can go and target them again really quick. So I usually try to get at least a dozen in a session. That takes me to notoriety 10.
So at this point, we're gonna move past murder, and if we have more questions, we can circle back to it at the end. But there's some other stuff that we wanted to talk about. This is just where I got my information before we go into the updates with the sheet. So between discussions with Nat, with Max, and Tarkus, as well as our own internal research and testing. So at this point, we're gonna skip the questions part, and we're gonna go into the updates that we've had to our BGS sheet, which I think I saw Alshane on here, right?
That's I think
Whoever's talking right now, you're really laggy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
I said that's me.
All right, do you want to do the sheet stuff, and then I can just like move around, because you probably know it better than I do. Or
It's not all that different from what everyone's used to. I mean, the main thing is the addition of the negatives, which you've covered.
yeah. So not here. I'll do this really quick. So for the most part, like Alshane just said, there's really not much different. The biggest difference is this part here, where it says negatives. This is just a way for you to log your negative contributions, and we've gone over what to do with that. You can see Max over here scrolling between all of them. As we mentioned, failed missions is 2 influence. So let's say I'm Alshane and I fail a mission, I'll put a 2 in. I fail a second mission, I'll change the 2 to a 4. I'll do it like that. Negative trade is credit. We went over that. We showed you guys what that looks like. This column here is black market trade, which for that would just be the credit value that you get for black market. It's not going to be a negative value, but it will still generate negative influence. As I mentioned, it's not really an option for us in the Legion because of us being an ALT space, as well as us being a patronage. And then murder, 1 kill, 1 murder. So I get 1 kill, I get 2 kills, I get 3 kills, etc. The only other thing really that, as far as the big changes, is this part here. So other factions, that's just first you'll see the faction we're working. Here, Dilworth Ring is our stations. this big list here, right here, that is all of the stations that we do not own. So you can go to any of these stations and do negative trade, assuming that there is a market at that station. That's probably the biggest change besides the whole introduction of negatives itself. That this is you have this full list of all those stations. That's basically it. Just one other thing with negatives. Um, there is no such thing as negatives when it comes to war and election. So any conflicts that we're in, uh, they're just because your influence is locked in conflicts. There's no way to like do negative trade in elections, for example. It won't change anything. So that's why if you were to look at the election tab, we have our 2 elections today, and there you don't see any negative values. Um, that is it with the sheet. For some reason, I thought that there would be more updates on the sheet, but I guess the bigger part was just going through all of the actual negative um, aspects. So at this point, are there any other questions about anything regarding the sheet, regarding negative influence, um, anything regarding BGS? Brad, so I can see your thing is like blinking.